Some people reject Christianity because they look at history and decide that Christianity causes violence. A widely cited example is the Crusades. It's true that shameful atrocities were carried out by both Christians and Muslims. These atrocities are a stain on both Christian history and world history. In the 20th century, Bertrand Russell argued that religions caused violence because they're divisive. Get rid of religion, he argued, and will open up a new era of cooperation based on the shared truths of science. Later in the 20th century, we saw the rise of Islamic terrorism, culminating most famously in the September the 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. This seemed to add even more evidence that religions inherently cause violence, a view held by new atheists such as Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. Islamic terrorism was seen as proof that all religions were violent, Christianity included. But, as Rebecca McLaughlin argues in Confronting Christianity, concluding that Christianity is inherently violent doesn't necessarily follow. Over the next few minutes, I'll highlight some of the key parts of her argument. The first place to look when assessing Christianity has to be the words and actions of Jesus. His words were radically opposed to violence. He told his followers not to resist evil people. When struck on one cheek, they should offer the other cheek as well. And he told them to pray for their enemies and persecutors. He reprimanded his followers for using force to resist his arrest by people who wanted to kill him. He willingly allowed himself to be killed in one of the most agonizing and humiliating ways imaginable. And his early disciples were mostly killed for their beliefs. Early Christianity spread not through violent conquest, but the opposite, believers who were willing to sacrifice their own lives to share the good news with others. This background makes the Crusades all the more confusing. It's correct to say that the atrocities committed by Christians are a shocking betrayal of the ethical teachings of Jesus. But the Crusades, according to the historian Thomas Madden, are one of the most misunderstood events in Western history. They're sometimes portrayed as unprovoked aggression by Christians towards peaceful Muslim communities, but this view doesn't take the context into account. Islam spread from its very inception through military conquest. Muhammad himself led armies. Traditionally Christian communities in Egypt, Palestine and Syria, followed by North Africa, Spain and modern-day Turkey, were conquered. Christians living there were exposed to varying degrees of persecution. Jerusalem was first conquered by Muslims in 673 AD and again in 1076. Then the persecution of Christians became more severe. Pilgrims were attacked, holy places were desecrated, and the city's patriarch was kidnapped. A cry for help was sent from the Eastern to Western Christians, and soon after, the First Crusade was called. None of this justifies the various atrocities committed by Christians during the Crusades, but it does show that the Crusades as a whole weren't unprovoked. Other Western critics of Christianity compare it unfavourably with Buddhism. Buddhism, they argue, promotes harmony and peace in a way that Christianity manifestly doesn't. But this is again based on a patchy knowledge of world history, or even current events. McLaughlin quotes an article in the New York Times, which gives a sample of violence committed by Buddhists in recent history. This includes the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar from 2017, the Sri Lankan Civil War, violence in modern-day Thailand, violence even in the Dalai Lama's own sect, and complicity in the Japanese nationalistic violence in the World War II era. And in many cases, it's not simply that Buddhists are committing violence, but also that the violence is linked to Buddhist identities and institutions. These details tend to be forgotten when Westerners view Buddhism through rose-tinted spectacles. At this stage, it seems logical to ask whether the answer is to reject religion entirely, as Bertrand Russell argued. Communism is both atheistic and highly critical of religion, and the history of communism proves that rejecting religion doesn't stop violence. 61 million deaths were the legacy of communism in Russia, 35 million deaths in China, and many more in North Korea, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The astonishing amount of death, destruction, and violence that atheistic communism managed to bring about in a short space of time should give pause to those who think that a religion-free world would be violence-free. It seems relevant here to briefly talk about Nazism. Is Nazism a stain on the history of atheism or religion? It's true that the Nazis didn't reject religion outright, but they did distort it beyond recognition. The Nazis removed the Old Testament from the Bible, tried to purge Jewishness from the New Testament, editing the teachings of Jesus to remove the idea of compassion for the weak, and created a new Lord's Prayer with Hitler's name instead of Our Father. Nazism doesn't have much to teach us about real Christianity, but it does show how religion can be manipulated to justify evil. But it doesn't logically follow that we would therefore be safer putting all of our hope in science. The Nazis also manipulated science to justify genocide. The Nazis believed that they were a superior race, and that Darwin's theory of evolution gave them the prerogative to destroy races they saw as inferior. Many scientists, both inside and outside Germany, supported Hitler's belief in a racial hierarchy. So while the Nazis did manipulate religion to justify their evil ideology, the same criticism can be applied to science. And I don't have time to cover all of McLaughlin's arguments here, but philosophy and democracy can also be criticized in that same way. Christianity's central symbol is the cross, an instrument of excruciating pain and death. Does this mean that Christianity glorifies violence? When we think of violence, we're thinking of the strong hurting the weak in the name of power, but Christ's death on the cross was the most powerful man who ever lived, allowing himself to be tortured and killed to save the powerless. It's the complete opposite of violence. It's the antithesis and the defeat of violence. The story of Christianity from Jesus to the early martyrs, the early church, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Martin Luther King is shot through with a radical rejection of violence. There's a lot more to this argument, and what I've shared here just touches on a few parts of it. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you want, but do read the book if you can. It answers a lot of the biggest questions people have about Christianity. I can't recommend it enough. Thanks for watching.